What's up, Internet? Robert Teegarden back again today with another installment on my How to Edit tutorial series for beginners. If you're new here, welcome. I put out content on a regular basis, weekly uploads surrounding content creation and the business of being a creative. So if you like what you see here, please consider subscribing. I'd love to have you into the community and have you follow along with exactly what we're doing here. If you've been following along with this series, you know that we've been doing a weekly upload on how to edit for beginners. And I've been walking you through my process from everything from file management all the way through on how to export. And this week, we're going to be talking about the most basic cuts that every editor needs to know for your production. The first thing I want to say about editing here is that you really have to understand the very reason that you're making these cuts in the first place. What we like to say is what's motivating that edit, that cut point. What is the story all about? And does your edit, does your transition, does your effect support the story that you're telling? Sometimes an edit you make is just to straight up fuck someone up. It's to flex on how great of an editor you are, the things that you can do and what you can offer stylistically for that particular project or for that particular client. A lot of the times though, you're doing dialogue, you're doing interviews, you're doing basic types of things that don't really require these tremendous transitions or effects that you would put into an edit. And so that's where I'm starting off right now. What are the most basic cuts that you as an editor need to know, and why would you be using those cuts in your project? The first thing I'm going to start out with is the most basic cut there is, and that's just a straight cut. Now, a straight cut is exactly what it seems. It's literally just making a cut between one piece of footage and another. This is probably the most common and most frequently used cut that you have because it's just piecing together two different pieces of footage in order for you to make the story go along or add something else to the dialogue. There's a bunch of ways to do that in Premiere, which is what I use on a regular basis, but I'm fluent in all of the other editing programs. You just simply hit C on your keyboard for cut or the blade tool, and you would go to wherever you want to make that particular cut on your piece of footage. And what you would end up with is two different pieces of footage. Or you can just set in and out points on the footage that you're using and drag it onto your timeline, and you'd have a straight cut there. Another option that I use all the time, because if you know me on this channel, you know that I'm just desperate for any type of efficiency, especially when it comes to keyboard shortcuts. I hate touching my mouse if I don't have to, so I'll use Command or Control K to make a straight cut on my timeline. I'll also use the Q key, which will eliminate any footage prior to where my cursor sits, or the W key, which eliminates anything that's after my cursor. An individual quick key doesn't necessarily seem like it's a huge time saver, but my whole theory on this is that when you aggregate them in total across an entire day's worth of editing, every individual millisecond that you can save accounts for a bunch of time at the end of the day, so you can work smarter and faster. Another cut that we use all of the time is a simple crossfade transition. Now you see this all the time. You see just a fade from one piece of footage to the next piece of footage. There's two main ways that I do this in Premiere. The first one is that I'll right click in between the two pieces of footage and a dialog comes up asking me if I want to apply the default transitions. I can click yes and it'll immediately apply a transition that is within 5 to 10 keyframes. You can change that if you'd like, but usually that's just the amount of time that you'll need. The other way that I would do that is hit Command or Control D on my keyboard. That will apply a default transition right at the seam of those two clips. Now the thing here is I have to do this when no clips are highlighted on my timeline, and it'll apply a default transition there. The other way of doing this that gives you a lot more control is to separate your video, your project into two different layers. So something on V1 and V2. You have your piece of footage on V2 extending over your piece of footage on V1. You set keyframes at different points on your piece of footage and drag them up or down. And what you're doing here is you're changing the opacity of individual pieces of footage on your own. Effectively, what you're using is this default crossfade transition, but you're now in control of how aggressive and how long those transitions take. And you can also set the different type of blend mode that you would be doing using that type of a crossfade, so you can have more dynamic range I guess it's not really range, but you would be able to do more dynamic transitions using these keyframes as you would with the basic transitions that they allow you to use in applying a default crossfade transition. The next thing I would use is, I forget, I always wonder isn't it called the jump cut? That's what it's called. It's called a jump cut. It's basically what I just did there, is that I'm literally just chopping my footage and moving it along inside of my timeline. And so you'll see this a ton on YouTube, especially when people like to chop out all of the space within their dialogue. Philly D does this all the time, just literally lops off all of the breaths or the dead air space, any ums in his dialogue. He'll just chop them out and make sure that everything runs as quickly as it possibly can. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this unless it's for effect. Again, what is motivating my cut? If it's something I'm trying to be funny about or some other reason for me to do that, I'll use a jump cut. But a lot of times I don't use it just because I'm talking, unless I have a very specific reason to do that. To do a jump cut, it's very simple. It's the same way that you would use a straight cut. You're just chopping your dialogue or your footage along and kind of mashing the two things together for whatever your purpose is and why it would suit your needs. Now, the last cuts I use all of the time are J&L cuts. And I've talked about this a bunch. I've actually have an entire video on how J&L cuts work. You can find it throughout the little cards that are about to pop up here. And you can use them in two different ways. The video I have really talks about how you would use a creative choice to have a J-cut when you would be receiving or giving a response inside your scene itself. So you would hear the dialogue happen while I'm still sitting on someone else's face or vice versa. But you can also use that from an audio standpoint or just simply have a piece of B-roll rolling over the top of your clip while your dialogue is coming up underneath. There's a really easy example I can show you here on how I would use a J-cut from a B-roll standpoint. Let's take a look at it on this clip that I have here.
I'm here in Denver, Colorado with a lot of my firefighters here to go over my RFT training and my new nutritional brand core. Today I'm gonna be...
So what I did there is I had the B-roll rolling on top of that dialogue, and there was a camera transition that happened in there, and I lopped off a lot of the dialogue in between those two positions. You can't see it because I treated the audio and brought it back in Audition, so it looks like one fluid piece of dialogue, but in reality I was mashing a bunch of pieces together. And so B-roll and these use of J&L cuts really helps tell the story and move it along in a more fluid, dynamic way, but you can use a J or an L cut in that way to kind of help aid your storytelling and cue the listener, the viewer, into what's coming next or give them a reason to sit on a particular reaction. A J or an L cut is a very simple technique. A J cut is when you let the dialogue play before the scene change or before you see the person talking. And opposed to that, an L cut is when you let the dialogue continue to play after a piece of B-roll comes in and the scene changes in that regard. So you can check out the video that I did earlier, or even in the dialogue video that I did in this series, the How to Edit for Beginner series, talks a lot about how I would use J&L cuts to assist in dialogue in that way too. So that's it for this particular episode on the most important cuts for beginning editors. What we talked about, I think, is really just the basis of what you would need to do. There's a bunch of other transitions and effects and things that you could be using on top of this, but I really just think that it's important to master the basics and understand the reasons why the basics are important before you start to go ahead and use these different types of transitions like a zoom transition or any type of camera or whip pans, those things. Those are all really effective and very neat techniques. I use them all the time, but there's a reason why I would use them. I'm not just slapping a transition on my footage, throwing a teal and orange color grade on there and sending it out in the world. That's not what I want people to understand about why it's important to really think through the editing process. Again, I'll say this before, editors are the final rewrite of the script. We're a part of telling the story, and it's our job, our obligation as editors to understand why these transitions work within our particular footage and why all of those things together collectively help tell our story. So, If you like this one, that's great. You know, like, share, subscribe. Be sure to check out all of the other videos that are in this series if you haven't already. And like I said, if you're just finding this channel, I would love for you guys to come along for the ride. Once again, this is Robert Teegarden. This has been another episode within the Teegarden How to Edit tutorial series. And remember, we're here to create our own path. Peace.